Welcome, everybody. Thank you for sharing a bit of your time with us this evening. Everyone currently in the room knows who I am, so I won't introduce myself, but it's nice to see all of you for our brown bag event tonight. I love this particular part of our brown bag series because it is the annual graduate student brown bag talk. And so I'm really excited to introduce three of the Educational Leadership Policy Program's amazing PhD students who are going to give a talk centered around teacher labor markets for today's talk. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Andrea Rodriguez, who is a full-time school administrator in addition to being a second-year PhD student in educational leadership policy. As a PhD student, her research interests lie primarily in teacher education and retention and instructional improvement. Her background in education is in elementary mathematics and science instruction, as she served as a classroom teacher for 7 years prior to entering administration. Also joining us tonight is Kristin Mansell, a second-year PhD student in educational leadership policy. She is currently a classroom teacher in middle-level science with national board certification in early adolescent science. Her research interests include grading policy reform, increasing teacher efficacy through targeted professional learning communities, special education policy, and the impact of formative assessment on science teacher pedagogical decisions. And lastly, Amy Robison is a current school administrator in the Dallas area of Texas and a first-year PhD student in our program. She is currently working on research projects related to the effect of rates of school disciplinary incidents on teachers' retention in schools, as well as programs that support teacher trajectories and overall retention rates in the profession. Very excited to turn it over to our three students for their presentation tonight.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Andrea Rodriguez. I am, like Dr. Kirksey said, I'm a second-year PhD student at Texas Tech, and I'm excited to present to you guys this evening. I had previously presented this work that I've been doing with Drs. Gottlieb and Kirksey at AEFP a few weeks ago. So we'll start out. This work has to do with STEM teacher pathways and where do they come from and where do they go. If you could just move the slide.
Sorry guys, my internet kicked me out. Let me get back on. Okay.
And we'll be on the policy context.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, perfect. So a little background to start with. We all know that within the school building, teacher quality is the most important factor in student achievement. And we also know that the recruitment and retention of high quality STEM teachers is important to the growth of our students, especially in our STEM opportunities. And we know that women and minorities are traditionally underrepresented in STEM careers. And so these groups are going to be even more benefited from access to high quality STEM education. So we also know that improvement in teacher quality has been a policy concern in both Texas and across the United States. And there is also a perception that STEM teachers leave teaching more frequently than other than teachers in other areas because they have options that will produce better salaries for them. So as far as Texas specifically is concerned, Texas has a variety of teacher preparation pathways in the state. There is a vast and varied marketplace, but however, this is not solving our teacher shortage problem. So we still have those problems regardless of the abundance of different pathways that we have. In fact, last month in March, Governor Abbott has formed a task force that's going to oversee, hopefully, efforts to improve the Texas teacher supply. So as far as prior research, There is some evidence that suggests that STEM positions are harder to fill for administrators than other disciplines. But on average, research suggests that STEM teachers don't turn over any more frequently. However, they are more susceptible to pressures in low-income schools, and they leave those more often than non-STEM teachers do. So we're not clear whether STEM teachers turn over more often, and we're also not clear where they go when they leave. And these are the gaps in the research that we're trying to fill. So this will lead us to our research questions. If you could advance the slide. Thank you. This leads us to our research questions that we're looking at. This brings us back to our work. We're using administrative data to try to answer the questions of, one, what are the patterns of new STEM teacher turnover over the span of 5 years? And then we're also trying to determine, among former classroom teachers, what are the most common careers that they go to following their exit from the classroom? So we classified STEM teacher turnover patterns relative to the following 2 buckets. And so we looked at traditional pathways, and these are going to be those ones in which certification is earned through university coursework. They traditionally include their academic courses, their specialized education courses, fieldwork, and certification exams. And then on the other hand, you have alternative certification programs. So these can take place in also institutes of higher education. They can also be offered through government agencies such as service centers and organizations such as Teach for America and Texas Teachers of Tomorrow. And then in our sample, we've also considered out-of-state certified teachers. So for the purpose of our study, we need to define turnover and attrition. So we are calling it turnover if the teachers move schools but continue teaching. So these are movers, they're going to stay in the classroom. Attrition is going to be those people who leave public education altogether. So we are calling those our leavers. So we constructed new teacher cohorts drawn from the University of Houston ERC. This is a longitudinal database that we use to formulate answers to our research questions. The sample includes math and science teachers, so we did not include technology, engineering, and those other elements of traditional STEM. We classified them as math and science teachers based upon their assigned content in their class, not based upon their certification. We also only considered teachers from grade 7 and up. There's a discrepancy in Texas in which some 6th grade teachers are on elementary campuses. And so for that purpose, we just dropped our 6th grade teachers altogether. And we looked at 5 cohorts of teachers with 0 years experience beginning in 2011-12. And we went through the 2015-16 school years. And we observed 6 observations per teacher. We had one observation before they began teaching and then 1 each year after for 5 years. And so where do they go? So we looked at some different segments of where the teachers that left or moved, where they ended up. So we have our movers and climbers, and those either changed to a different public school. And when I say climbers, I mean ones that stayed within education but moved into a non-teaching role. So they changed to a different public school, or they moved into administration or an instructional coaching position. We find that some STEM teachers are leaving to pursue further education at colleges, universities, and professional schools. And then many of them are taking new jobs outside of public education. And so we considered both sectors and specific jobs for this category. So to start with, who are our STEM teachers in Texas? So our demographic characteristics are shown here. We see that they are majority female in both math and science. The 45% of math teachers that are male is a little bit surprising, as there is an idea that teachers in general are mostly female. They're mostly white and non-Latinx in both math and science. Most of them hold a bachelor's degree as their highest level of education. Math teachers do make slightly more pay than the science teachers do. Math teachers are going to be more frequently certified through alt certification, through traditional certification pathways, whereas our science teachers are opposite, and they're more frequently going to use alternative certification programs. So more than half of our science teachers are certified through a government agency alternative certification program. So that is much greater than our math. So research question 1. Annual math teacher attrition by year, annual math teacher attrition by year into teaching, okay? So we're looking here, and you can see year 1 is going to be in blue. So you can see, for example, out-of-state teachers, after year 1, 62% of them are leaving. You can see year 2 is in orange, and so that's going to be it for the same out-of-state population. 18% of them are leaving after year 2. The gray is year 3, yellow is year 4, and the light blue is going to be after year 5. So some observations we can make from this: our out-of-state teachers, it seems that they know that they're done teaching fairly quickly. The other groups remain fairly consistent in how much they turn over each year. It also appears that if you stick through your first few years of teaching, you have a better chance of sticking it out. There becomes less of a chance that you will leave. And so when we look at the same thing for science, the graph is the same. Year 1 is going to be noted in blue and orange and so on. The graphs look relatively fairly similar. You can tell that your traditional certification teachers in both math and science, those are going to fare better as far as staying in the classroom than your other certification pathways. So as far as our leavers, these are going to, half of the leavers, so half of our teachers who leave the classroom are going to remain in public education, and they're going to accept roles in administration, teacher facilitation, department heads, or central office roles. The rest of them, math teachers in general, or specifically, they are going to, this is the way, these are the different industries and sectors that they end up in. So of those teachers who leave each year, more math teachers are going to go into higher education and administrative support services. About 1/10 of them go into the energy sector. So in Texas, teachers frequently come in and out of teaching from the oil industry. So this could explain that 11% of our math teachers who end up in energy that's seemingly slightly disconnected. And then there's also science teachers. This is going to look similar, except for science teachers are going into the healthcare industry more frequently, which is something that you might expect. The energy sector is also there with 13% of science teachers going into energy. And like I said, that could be attributed to the Texas specific economy, the dynamics of our economy. So as far as what this all means, so except for our out-of-state alternative certification teachers are turning over more in both math and science. Our institutes of higher education are generally producing better outcomes for teacher retention. As far as patterns we're noticing, math teachers who leave most frequently go into higher education upon exit. Science teachers are more frequently going into healthcare. Largest percentages of math and science teachers who leave their current positions are still going into another position in public education. So that might be some better news there. Key takeaways here, we are determining that teacher preparation pathway is an important indicator for turnover for STEM teachers. Your STEM teachers often leave your public schools for other jobs within their field. Math and science teacher turnover is at its highest at the very beginning of a teacher's career. So some implications for policy: we must continue to make efforts to support our alt-cert teachers to increase their retention. We could include different types of professional development, salary increases, retention bonuses, and different types of ecosystems to support our teachers. Another thing to consider is, are STEM teachers leaving education for higher salaries, or are they looking for better working conditions? So if we could answer this question, this would help us focus our policy strategies for improvement. And that is what I have today. If you guys have questions, that is my email. And now I will go ahead and turn it over to Kristin Mansell. She is going to look specifically at how the composition of science classrooms is affecting teacher turnover and retention.
Kristin, you're muted.
Yeah.
I didn't mean anything I just said. So what I'm presenting today is very preliminary research, but we are looking at the impact of support personnel in the science classroom. And I want to define what support personnel is referring to, so you have a little bit of context before I really get started. But when I'm referring to support personnel, I'm talking about co-teachers that might be certified teachers, whether they be special education or other certified teachers that are helping in a classroom, and also paraprofessional aides, which may be assigned to a classroom because of discipline needs, special education needs, or simply because it's a new teacher in the profession. So just a little bit of background, and Dr. Cooksey mentioned the fact that I am a middle school science teacher. So some of this information is very close and dear to my heart. And I actually spoke with my other science teachers about this today because I felt like this research was very relevant, and especially learning from Andrea before, it's also very connected to teacher retention and where these teachers go and where they come from. One thing that I do want to mention is the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. Because of that Great Recession, we had a lot of budget cuts in education. And so because of those budget cuts, some of our classroom sizes increased, which caused a surplus of teachers in the market. After the Great Recession was over in 2009 and more CTE pathways became a focus, STEM pathways became a focus, and other research-based practices became a focus, that's kind of where our teacher shortage began. And I just want to say that up front. Some things that I found interesting is that science teachers are actually 26% more likely than other teachers nationally from other disciplines to leave their profession, especially in the first 5 years of teaching. They're 35% more likely to leave the profession. There were studies from Allen and Sims, as well as several from Ingersoll, that talked about the fact that even looking at similar schools, it's the science teachers that leave at higher rates in the curriculum areas. Now, in Andrea's ERC database, we did see math, but on a national level, it's really science that's being turned over the most at a national level. Because of that, we're having underqualified teachers fill those vacancies. And when I mean underqualified teachers, I mean those with less than 5 years of teaching experience, those that may be alternative certified and not in that traditional pathway, as well as teachers that may or may not actually have the correct certification. And so because of those underqualified teachers perhaps filling some of these vacancies, we're seeing pretty high levels of turnover. Okay, thanks, Simi. In specific to science, and why science is a little bit different than other curriculum areas, is that we kind of, Amy, I think you skipped this slide. Can you go back? I'm sorry. Okay, so just to give context, science teachers are often required to teach multiple science disciplines in a school year. My research is focused mostly on high school 7 through 12 science, and just specific to those grade levels. In middle school, we have integrated science. In Texas, a 7th grade teacher would be required to teach about thermal energy, matter cycling, carbon cycling, water cycling, organic compounds and chemistry, molecules, and then go into forces, weathering, catastrophic events, and other natural disasters. So science teachers in those middle grades are teaching a little bit of life science, a little bit of earth science, and a little bit of the physical sciences. When you go up into high school, it might be that one of your classes is biology, 2 chemistries, 2 physics. And I think that's important because research shows that any teacher, regardless of curriculum, when assigned multiple courses, they're more likely to quit the profession or to leave for a job that has a better working condition. And science is one that fills that role of multiple disciplines, really no matter what grade level that you have. Our science standards are pretty rigorous. Next Gen Science Standards came out in 2013. The TEAC standards have been updated over the last few years. They're even having new science standards come out in 2022 in August. And our standards are rigorous. They're not what they were 20 years ago. They're not memorizing different facts. They're using them because of the science and engineering practices that are a portion of the next generation science standards. Science is a tested subject. That means that we have accountability measures just as mathematics and language arts tests are concerned. And because of that, is a lot of stress added when you're a tested subject. Additionally, kind of what Andrea talked about, science teachers may have additional science degrees or alternative teaching certification, but one thing that's important to mention for science teachers is that those degrees are specific to content. So if you have an undergraduate degree or you've reached an alternative certification for teaching, it might be that your undergraduate degree is in biology, but you're expected to teach chemistry and physics. And that's one thing that is inherent within the science teaching profession. Additionally, for science teachers, we have a little bit different set of issues when we have our support practices. Because we have those specific rigorous standards, it may not be that administration or even special education teachers are able to understand how to implement those teaching standards. Additionally, content standards that are specific to science is that we have expectations for activities and for experiments within our content because of the science and engineering practices. If we're looking at special education students, we have all students within our classroom. There are no additional classes that those students could go in to receive extra supports. And when we look at teacher turnover, and after I've told you all these different reasons why science has specific curriculum issues, it's no surprising that teachers cite dissatisfaction as a reason for leaving teaching. In fact, 55% of teachers do. I'd like to bring the fact that 25% are dissatisfied because the assessments and accountability measures, there's not enough support for those assessments. And 17% of that 55% cite discipline issues were an issue at the school, and that was one of their reasons for leaving. Stress is very high rates in those that quit the profession, and it may be because of those things that occur within classrooms that create those additional stressors. So I wanted to bring this as a conceptual framework for what I kind of think is happening. There's a science teacher shortage. We know that's been here for the last 5, 6, 10 years even. And so science teachers are hired, and they're hired from a variety of different places: traditional certified, alternative certified. They may even be emergency certified. They may not have any teaching background whatsoever. They may not have any certification. Student teachers are hired to do their student teaching as a science teacher. And some of these teachers have pretty high turnover levels, and we learned that with Andrea's work and then some other things I'm going to be talking about. And just to kind of reiterate reasons why this might be happening and how this teacher retention model seems to play a part in my conceptual framework is that, again, science teachers have some specifics about them. We have consumables and supplies, and there are times where those supplies are not maybe funded by the school as much as you would want. Because of that, those higher wage options are very tempting to go to. Because of those content expectations, there are laboratory expectations and hands-on expectations that science teachers have in their day-to-day classroom. Because of that, discipline issues are a little bit higher. If you have kids working in groups and doing experiments, it's more likely to have discipline issues. And you have to have good classroom management skills to be able to, overcome those discipline issues. And sometimes our newer teachers just don't do that or don't have those skills yet, especially those that were alternative certified, emergency certified, or just really not in that highly qualified bucket of teachers just yet. They may be lacking pedagogical knowledge because of the differences in content that have to be taught throughout the year and even sometimes throughout the day. And because science teachers are not math and language arts teachers, there's sometimes additional issues with interventions. There's additional issues with accommodations, because when science teachers are accommodating classes, those accommodations may be with experiments, which just compounds the issues within classroom management and needing to have those strong pedagogical skills that sometimes they just don't have. One thing that may not be apparent with what Andrea was referring to or within other research is that sometimes those new career teachers are given those classrooms that have the largest issues that could be burdensome to teaching. And that's really what this focuses on, is what those classroom characteristics look like and why some of our science teachers may be more prone to be turning over or attrition levels because of those classroom characteristics. It's just basic supply and demand. And you can look at the supply and demand from two different lenses. You could look at it through a labor market lens and a science teacher lens. Really, that science teacher lens is a teacher's career at a school has to outweigh alternative employment. And sometimes that just doesn't happen because of those school and classroom characteristics. Which brings me to the present study. And I know I gave a lot of background. However, I felt like it was important to really ground us in what I'm looking for and what this research shows. So there's some pretty good gaps in research, especially at the science teacher level. Now, there's teacher retention, attrition work. This is a well-studied phenomenon. It's kind of hard to really give a quantitative numerical factor to it because wages and other numerical things are not in control of the teacher. Wages are tied to districts. And so that's a little bit different to be able to really research those cause and effects. There's socioeconomic research, certification type, the things that Andrea was speaking of, and specific to science, though, they do talk about prior degree type. And one thing that's interesting is that physics and engineering teachers oftentimes have very high levels of turnover, which makes you wonder if that's because of the wage gap in alternate areas of employment. The gaps in literature specific to science teacher turnover that I'm going to be looking at is the classroom characteristics, specifically special education and discipline levels, and the support of personnel impact on those characteristics. So in today's discussion, we're looking at the first research question: how does classroom composition associate with science teacher retention? We will add to this research over the next few months and look at how those support personnel impact the teacher's decisions to turnover. So stay tuned to the additional research. But I did want to bring these classroom composition effects to you all in this graduate student talk today. Much like the others, I will be using data, administrative data from a Texas school district. This data includes demographics, transcripts, discipline records, teacher credentials. This district has about 28,000 students, 2,000 teachers currently. I'm looking at 7th through 12th grade science teachers from 2012 to 2019. 892 science teachers total, with 189 that are categorized as turnover teachers, which is 21% of my sample. The STAR scores are specific to 8th grade in biology. Discipline records are disaggregated by in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and expulsion records. Within this data, I wanted to give you a little bit of a descriptive statistic of those classrooms that have no turnover in them and the classrooms that the teacher does turn over in. Some things that I found interesting in this was that the teachers who had their turnover, their classroom characteristics of the turnover teachers, they had a greater level of minority students. Additionally, they had higher levels, higher percentage of special education students that were aggregated together as peers, and they also had higher levels of free and reduced lunch. Sorry, Amy, I know we're just kind of sitting, waiting on the slide. Additionally, if I look at those teachers who have turnover classrooms, they have lower STAR scores. They also have lower proficiency numbers as a whole, with a proficiency level of 4,000 for that 8th grade STAR score. We also see total discipline levels being higher, with about 27% as compared to 17% of teachers without a higher turnover level. I wanted to throw this graph in, and I know I have 6th grade teachers in it, but I felt like this is kind of important to look at as far as the teacher turnover rates by grade. 6th grade is not considered a portion of my data, but I wanted to put it in there because I think it's important, because it shows a ground that 6th grade is an elementary certification, and we have a pretty larger amount of science teacher turnovers compared to just the average district, which could possibly correlate to 6th grade teachers maybe not wanting to be in that content specific. So that's why I threw 6th grade in. Additionally, I'd like to draw your attention to 8th grade, where science teacher turnover is higher than the average within the district. 8th grade is a STAR test grade level for science. 7th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 12th grade, science teacher turnovers are lower. None of those are tested subjects. And then in 11th grade, it's also interesting that science teacher turnover is higher because that's where we find a lot of our more specialty sciences like physics, engineering, and different electives for science. So I thought that that graph was interesting. So for my first research question, and what we're going to focus on the remaining time that I have, is how does classroom composition associate with science teacher retention? Now, what we saw in my descriptive statistics table is that science teacher turnover classes had higher minority numbers. They had higher poverty levels. They had higher levels of special education. They had lower STAR scores, and they also had higher discipline. Those of us in education are like, yeah, that would perhaps cause some turnover going on if all those different factors are there. But what's interesting is when we see those different factors and how they relate to each other. I also want to bring one thing before I really get into these classroom characteristics is about the STAR test. That STAR test is not really growth dependent in science as it is in mathematics and language arts. Not only is it not tested every single year, but the content that's being tested is different. And while I do plan on putting science scores in as a lag variable, I didn't feel like it was really needed to be put into those characteristics just yet, because as an example, in 5th grade, a student knows matter has physical properties, but in 8th grade, the next time that it's tested, they know that there's chemical properties and then there's molecules. And so the standards are very different, but that will be included in models in the future. So classroom characteristics that we're looking at, the first one is discipline. A lot of that has to do with just the fact that discipline is a problem in a classroom. I already told you about in a science classroom how it does take a little extra management for groups and experiments to actually occur, but just nationally, 20% of teachers report being threatened, 12% actually report being physically attacked. Disruptive students are one of the major reasons that teachers do decide to turn over. And I'd like to point out that another colleague who is currently looking at this same data found an interesting suggestion in his research, is that teachers whose classroom had at least one incidence of discipline is 7.7% more likely to turn over. Now, that's not specific to science teachers, that's for this entire district, but I did want to mention that that research is current and ongoing and does play into this classroom characteristic. The next classroom characteristic that I want to talk about is just real quickly special education. Special education is a research interest of mine, and I think that it's important to mention, especially in the state of Texas. Those of us that have a context of special education in the state of Texas know that Texas has had a little bit of policy going on with special education here lately. In 2004, there was a cap put at the number of students that could be classified as special education at 8.5%. In 2017, that legislation was overturned. However, we're still not seeing really high numbers of special education, which makes us wonder, do students with minor disabilities, have they gone under-identified and under-serviced? And that may be something that we're seeing in this study. However, there's actually some pretty cool statistical significance that we'll get into. I do want to say that IDEA does require IEPs. There are accommodations associated with that. And in the science classroom, we have all ability types. And so that becomes problemsome. And science knowledge combines reading and math skills. And we have to use reading and math skills to learn science content, which kind of compounds those issues that students with special education have within the science classroom. So with my analysis after the descriptive statistics, I did a few different regressions. I have 4 different models. The first model, and what I'm looking at is high levels of special education classification and what effect that has on science teacher turnover. My first model is just what effect does it have? The second model, I've put in some student demographics. The third model, I added in discipline, and the fourth model, I added in attendance. And what you'll find is once I started adding in student characteristics, we have some pretty extreme statistical significance going on. For each of my second, third, and fourth model, we are seeing statistical significance of high levels of special education and science teacher turnover. What I found interesting is the differences in demographics that are associated with that, where when we have discipline, we're looking at different ethnicities, and total discipline is a higher statistical significance than ISS, OSS expulsion, which makes sense. But when we look at attendance, we're also looking at higher poverty students having a greater effect, different minority compositions, and ultimately attendance has a higher level of statistical significant effect on our special education and the association to science teacher turnover. So just as a discussion point and key takeaways, special education placement alone doesn't seem to completely associate with science teacher turnover until I start adding student characteristics. Preliminary findings suggest associations with both discipline and lower attendance rates. That high absenteeism appears to have a greater impact really than total discipline, which really makes sense. I mean, if the kiddos aren't there, then they may struggle, and that might be troublesome to a teacher having to remediate and do interventions. Those characteristics of teacher turnover classrooms, they appear to have higher poverty rates. They have more minority students. They have higher incidences of discipline than those teachers that don't have those higher rates of turnover. And I can't ignore that STAR science score, even though I know it is not really a growth factor. But those teachers who have higher turnovers also have lower science scores. Now, is that a compounding factor of the fact that it's higher poverty, it's higher minority, it's higher discipline? We're not really sure, but it does lend itself to that conclusion, and further analysis will be done to be able to try to really make sense of that type of data. So in the future, I do plan to connect teacher characteristics to determine the impact of those support personnel. That's kind of next steps. But for now, I do believe these classroom demographics show some really interesting information, and it helps to, reiterate prior research, but really at a more specific science placement. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I want to turn it over to Emmy Robison currently, and she's looking at a mixed methods study on opportunity culture and its impact on teacher retention and some other super cool stuff. So here's to you, Emmy.
All right, and thanks everyone for your patience. I have pressed the button as soon as it feels like it's the right time and the slides are not transitioning quickly. So even now I pressed it when I started talking. So I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about a teacher coaching and mentoring model that one of the explicitly stated goals is to improve retention, which is something we're talking about all evening tonight. So first, let's start by saying what we know, that teacher quality matters. It's been proven time and again. They're one of the most important in-school factors related to student achievement. And obviously, therefore, we need to develop strong teachers and keep them in the classroom. I think some of the research that Andrea presented about how many teachers leave and go into administration is really interesting. because if you imagine that those are strong teachers and they leave the classroom, we lose the ability to have them impact students. So this research will be specifically focused on Ector County Independent School District, ECISD. ECISD is a large public school district in Odessa, Texas, 44 schools serving 32,000 students. It's a very diverse student population, 78% Hispanic, 15% white. 60.3% are considered at risk of dropping out, and that's an identifier that the district uses. 55% are considered economically disadvantaged, 20% are limited English proficiency, and the district consistently scores below the Texas state average for college readiness. So you might say that this is a struggling district. Another interesting feature of Ector County Independent School District is it faces an extreme teacher shortage year after year. In fact, in June of 2021, there were 340 teacher openings just weeks before the school year was supposed to start. Those of us who work in administration know how stressful it is when you have even one opening that's unfilled, but for a district to have 340 openings in June with an August start date, that just proves the point. So why is that? Why does Ector County struggle to find teachers? Well, the local oil fields, as we've talked about a few times, pull talent away. There's a high cost of housing. This is a national trend, but it's specifically challenging in Ector County where wages are low. And they've been lower than a national average before a tax ratification in 2018, as well as the relative geographic isolation of ECISD. We're not talking about a Dallas or a Houston in Texas. It can be hard to recruit people to come to Odessa, Texas. With the recent increase in oil prices that we've all been experiencing at the pump, we expect this challenge to only be worsened. Ector County is working through a number of interventions to support teacher quality and retention, one of which is opportunity culture. Opportunity culture comes out of the National Education Organization Public Impact. It was started in 2009, and their theory of action is that they select and reward strong teachers for excellence in the classroom by giving them a new role called a multi-classroom leader. We'll refer to them as MCLs. MCLs extend their reach by reach it to more students by working with a team of teachers who they coach and provide instructional support for. So the MCL stays in the classroom, they continue to teach, and they also spend part of their day coaching, leading a PLC, supporting other teachers on their teams. So for this study, we looked at a quantitative analysis of the program as well as a qualitative analysis of the program. The quantitative side focused on student achievement outcomes. Oops. Now it wants to go too fast. So, oh boy, we've gone way too far. I promise I know how to use PowerPoint. The research question: do students perform better on standardized achievement tests when taught by a multi-classroom leader, an MCL, or by a team teacher in tested subject areas? Does this vary by subject areas, or does it, and as well as does it vary by demographic groups? So just to break down the numbers of what we looked at, we're talking about a total of about 6,500 students who had access to an opportunity culture teacher. And again, that's referring to both MCLs and team teachers, compared to about 14,000 students who did not have access to an opportunity culture teacher. We're also specifically focusing on those limited English proficiency students and at-risk students. So the data was analyzed using school level fixed effects. And the reason for this is that there is great variability on campuses in opportunity culture implementation. The data was compared 2020, there were over 20,000 students that we looked at. We looked at the 2020-2021 school year, and we compared that to 2019 data, spring of 2019. The reason we're comparing spring of 2021 to spring of 2019 was because there's no spring of 2020 data due to COVID. So we looked at STAR assessments for 3rd through 8th graders. There was course specific information that was used to link teachers to students. And the analysis was restricted to students who participated in STAR reading and math assessments, had complete demographic data, and had prior STAR achievement scores from 2019. And the findings are pretty profound. These are the differences in a standard deviation unit on an opportunity culture's teacher's impact on student achievement in reading and math. You can see that the multi-classroom leader scored 0.4 standard deviations above the mean in reading, and the team teacher also saw a significant gain at 0.2 standard deviations above the mean. In math, not quite as staggering of gains, but still something to note. Looking at this in specific demographics that we are interested in, again, when we're looking at reading achievement, our students who are considered at risk gained up to 0.6 standard deviations on that STAR test if they're taught by an MCL, and almost 0.2 standard deviation units on a team teacher. Limited English proficiency students gained, again, nearly 0.6 standard deviation units above the mean, and if taught by an MCL, and with a team teacher, 0.3 standard deviations above the mean. This is really important because those multi-classroom leaders are expected to see growth. They're considered the best teachers. That's why they're given this role. But the team teachers that they're coaching are not considered the best teachers. So we're really talking about significant improvements on those teachers who are coached by those MCLs. So the takeaways here. The teaching model appears to correlate in a positive immediate academic gains for students. Then as an administrator, again, what more could you look for than that? The associations are most pronounced in reading assessments, and they're most pronounced for students with limited English proficiency and considered at risk. And the magnitude of the gains was significant. To put it into plain terms, having an MCL leader or a team teacher is equivalent to replacing the average ECISD teacher with an ECISD teacher in the top quartile. So when we're talking about giving a struggling school district the best teachers, this is one way of doing it. On the qualitative side, we really wanted to look at MCL perceptions of opportunity culture. The conceptual framework we used is the jobs, demands, resources model. And what this model does is it conceptualizes work conditions as a balance between demands, such as difficult tasks, high workload, or emotionally taxing responsibilities, and resources such as support, positive work climate, and compensation, and uses these constructs to predict levels of burnout in employees. This model argues that when job demands are high or unfavorable, employees will feel increased levels of exhaustion, but not necessarily disengagement. The model also suggests that when resources are lacking, high levels of disengagement can be predicted, but not necessarily exhaustion. In jobs with both a lack of resources and high demands, employees experience both exhaustion and disengagement, and this is what we would call burnout. The opportunity culture is an intervention designed to increase teacher job resources while reducing job demands with the goal of improving teacher quality and teacher retention and thus student learning. So I listed out just a handful of demands and resources in teaching in general, some specifically to ECISD as well as this time. But anyone who's been in the classroom could tell you about the various roles or demands of teaching, as well as things that helped to offset that. So our research question for the qualitative study is, how do MCLs perceive the demands and resources of opportunity culture in ECISD? To answer this question, we conducted a series of semi-structured interviews with the MCLs. All school levels, meaning elementary, middle, and high, were invited to participate. Ector County scheduled the interviews, and 28 interviews were conducted in person in January 2022. The data analysis is ongoing. At this point, we have gone through all of the interviews and coded them using this framework that you're looking at. And the next step is to analyze it. But I wanted to break this down. After our interviews, we created kind of a code book for demands, resources, as well as outcomes. We know that ECISD started opportunity culture because they wanted to improve student learning, teacher quality, and retention. So we wanted to see if answers correlated to those. But some of the demands we talked through are an MCL who has to plan for coaching, doing data analysis, adding administrative work, PLC collaboration. We added a code specifically for burnout when we heard that. Other MCL responsibilities, different tools that the campus has used. We added a code for difficult for every time someone mentioned that something was challenging, the coaching cycle, or when they referenced their teacher role, such as I have 26 students of my own to teach. The various resources, including buy-in, administrative support, a reach associate or teacher assistant, which is someone who works with that MCL to give them that partial release schedule, a positive school culture, professional trust, additional compensation, collegial trust, and professional growth opportunities. So without having the full analysis to present, I'd just like to share some quotes, and I won't read them, but just to talk about them. One thing that continued to come up were the demands of the MCL roles. The MCLs, again, are teachers. They have a full-time teaching load, often with an hour or more of partial release, but they have their own students to work through. And the demands of the job include a lot of coaching. So they're performing both drop-ins as frequently as every day, but then also full coaching cycles where they're spending, as this person said, up to 45 minutes in someone else's classroom. Another demand of the MCL role are the PLC meetings. In almost every campus, there were weekly PLC meetings, and they were doing data digs, lesson planning, and lots of heavy lifting to be leading a team through that. I think I mentioned this, MCLs receive a significant stipend as part of their role. Sometimes it can be up to 20% more, up to $16,000 more a year, a really significant stipend. Some MCLs described this as motivating, and others felt that it made them a target of negativity, or that the additional compensation was used to justify extensive administrative duties beyond what they had signed up for. So this first person talked about resentment that some of their team members may have felt. And the second person just said, I'm not sure it's worth it given how much extra I'm taking on. Another big theme was trust on the teams, both professionally and collegially. A lot of the MCLs discussed how they had to build first collegial trust. Their teams had to trust them as people and knew that they cared about them as individuals before they could trust them to help them as coaches. And they had to create buy-in into the program. So this person talked about their relationship and the things that they did to build those relationships and how it helped get that buy-in into the process. Another theme was that the MCL role is considered by many to be a dream job. Many said that they got to stay in the classroom, which they really wanted to do, but they were able to take on more and help more people and grow other teachers. So it really plays to the best of both worlds. I get to be a teacher, but I'm kind of a super teacher in that I get paid more and I get to support other people. As I mentioned, burnout was a big theme. Many of these MCLs were taking on a ton of responsibilities outside of just their teaching jobs. And sometimes they just talked about the heavy workload and they talked about juggling and how that was a challenge. And then on the extreme end, some people talked about it just being completely unsustainable. This person said, I go home and work until 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock every morning. This is an extreme case, but the concern is that these are the best teachers and sometimes we pile on too much on them. So as I mentioned, the data analysis is ongoing. We are starting to really dig into it and look for trends, and we are looking to find out more about how the teachers impact what their experience is like in addition to their impact on student achievement. We'll be following up with the 2022 STAR data, which we should have in July, and following up with some teacher walkthrough and observation data. So thank you very much. I'm going to finally stop screen sharing so you can stop watching me butcher a PowerPoint, and I will turn it over to questions.
Yeah, so we have about 5 minutes for any questions that anyone has for our presenters.
I have a question. This is Annette about the opportunity culture data. This year, what are some of the questions that you're going to be researching or asking, if you have those already, in looking at the data? Now that we won't have to necessarily look at 2-year-old data, you'll have pretty much a prior year and a current year set of data. Do you predict that would be different?
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic question is still the same. What are the impacts on student achievement on team teachers and students taught by team teachers and MCLs? But I think one thing that we were talking about today in our meeting was we have two other questions that we'd like to dig into. Many MCLs applied for the job at one campus and then received the job and were asked to move to a different campus. It would be very interesting to look at the differences in data in MCLs who were brand new to a campus. Were they able to spend as much time coaching, or did they have to spend more time building relationships with people since they were new? Another question is campuses where opportunity is in its first year or second year, are there differential effects there? So those are some of the interesting questions we're looking into for July.
Awesome. Thank you. I work in that district, and so I'm just a little interested if we were going to look at some additional questions, just because we do have more support for the MCL, so it'll just be interesting to see. Whereas last year there wasn't as much, so it'll be interesting to see. I do have a question for Kristin because I was really interested in the SPED as well, if that's okay. Is that okay that I go that I ask her a question, or does someone else want to go? I won't hog up the whole time.
Go for it.
Yeah, for students receiving special ed services, I had a conversation with the middle school teacher right before I jumped on. I'm sorry I was late, but she expressed a concern that we have a lot of learned helplessness with students receiving special education services, especially at the middle school level, because there's a mindset of in the lower grades that we potentially, shouldn't retain students, and maybe we have an, unspoken policy to not retain special education students, but at the same time, we're also not maybe building them up. So, are you going to look into that at all by any chance, or any thoughts on that?
So I do actually have a few thoughts on that. I don't know that it's really honestly related to this research, but I think that looking at special education as far as growth between, one year to the next, and looking at how teachers handle that growth, how they're placed in classrooms, I think is very important. From a practitioner standpoint, I definitely understand the concerns. And again, from a practitioner standpoint, I believe that all children can learn at high levels, and just because of a special education placement does not necessarily put them into a specific, portion or characteristic. However, they're still a vulnerable population, and we need to, as such, be able to research them and to understand what that need of them in those IDEA requirements have on teacher effects and on different other characteristics within a school. I do think it's very interesting, and I agree with your colleague and your concerns about special education and retention and what all that means, and are we, lowering standards and things like that. But again, I guess as a middle school practitioner, all students can learn at high levels, regardless of their classification or regardless of where they're at in the numbers. And maybe that's a look at a qualitative at another point in time, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you. And I did jump on late, so I didn't see the entire presentation, so you may have covered it. Thank you for answering that.
Any other questions before we wrap up for this evening?
I was just going to say you guys did a great job, especially as they all tied in together. So I guess you planned it that way, but they seem to all sort of piggyback on each other and tell the rest of the story. So I appreciated that. And it was all very interesting. Well done, guys, ladies. Thank you.
So if we need help writing this up for a project that we might have for another class, could we reach out to Kristin and Emmy to would y'all be open to helping some of us that are currently doing some of these things and are having to put some projects together or assignments together?
I heard there's some class going on right now that y'all may be having to do some of that stuff for, and the three of these amazing women may or may not be in that class and offer you support, but I think that would be, yeah, totally fine. And Andrea too is in that class and has written her data and method section for that paper as well, so. Okay, well, thank you all. That was amazing. And I agree with Marianne. The themes that you all brought together and kind of drew between the three distinct but over kind of related areas of research was just really, really great to listen to. And especially you three being current educators, administrators yourselves. That was really interesting that you could provide that perspective to it as well. So thank you everyone for coming to this brown bag. We do have one more brown bag at the end of the semester, but it is post, well, I guess it's after the end of the semester. So this is the last official brown bag while the spring semester is still technically happening. So thank you for joining us this year. It's been really wonderful to hear all the different areas of research and exciting presentations from TTU and beyond. So please reach out to our wonderful presenters if you have questions or follow-up about their presentations. And otherwise, I will see many of you next week.